1976, there was a TV show called Schoolhouse Rock. And Schoolhouse Rock in that year debuted a segment entitled, I'm Just a Bill. Some of you, I did not know this until I was thinking about this for this sermon. I thought it was titled something else. Instead of being titled, I'm Just a Bill, I thought it was titled How a Bill Becomes a Law. And if you remember this, it was the story of Bill, and he was trying to become a law in the governmental system of the United States. It was a 3-minute segment, and this 3-minute segment taught the entire process of our government of taking an idea to becoming a bill, to being signed and passed, and then ultimately becoming a law in our land. And they debuted it, and it was kind of popular, but over the years, it's become a cult sensation. Become a cult sensation, and it's been featured in popular culture ranging from The Simpsons to Saturday Night Live, Legally Blonde 2 to the Stephen Colbert Show. Lots of times using it for humor, lots of times using it to prove a satirical point. But the fact of the matter is that for many of us that have grown up in the past 45 years, 46 years, this short 3-minute video was the key to understanding a process that can oftentimes seem overwhelming and out of our hands. How does a bill become a law? Well, when it comes to being a follower of Jesus, follower of Christ, we hear the word law thrown about church a lot. The law, Old Testament law. We talk about it often. We read in Scripture about the law. Jesus talks about the law. Paul talks about the law. But do we really know what we're talking about when we say the law? Oftentimes we don't, and it's like we need a 3-minute video that tells us how we got the law and what the law means and where it came from. So let's see if we can figure out, make it easier for you to understand what this law we talk about is. When we reference the law, we're talking about Mosaic law. And this is the law that was given to Moses after the Exodus from slavery in Egypt. And so it's laid out, it begins with the 10 Commandments, which Moses received on Mount Sinai, and it's laid out in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is 4 of the first 5 books of the Bible. The first 5 books of the Bible are the Torah, and the Jewish people learn the Torah, they memorize the Torah, and so they would know the law by heart. And these were not just instructions for living, this was the law of the land that God had given Moses to his people. It covers the 10 Commandments, moral laws, social laws, purity laws, laws for food, and instructions for religious order and leadership. Had covered everything you could possibly imagine. And there was every minute detail you could think of. And this law would rule the people of Israel for the entirety of the Old Testament. They would go through and they would learn the law and they would know it, and the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they would enforce it and make sure that it was being carried out. This law was given as part of God's covenant with the people of Israel after Moses led them out of Egyptian slavery. Because when they were in Egyptian slavery, they were living under Egyptian law. Well, now they were free, and they needed something to guide them, to govern them, to rule them. And if they followed the law, God made promises to them, such as living in the promised land of Canaan. But if they didn't follow the law, then we would see punishment and suffering and discipline. And this law was given to the nation of Israel. It was for the nation. And as we look throughout the Old Testament, we see examples of them both obeying, the Israelites both obeying and breaking the laws of the covenant. And then we get to the point that it's the end of the Old Testament, and then there's a 400-year period of silence that God does not speak, because at the end of the Old Testament, God is speaking to the prophets, and he's giving warnings, and he's giving glimpses of what's to come. And then he goes quiet for 400 years. And he's not speaking. And then we get to what we call the New Testament. And we see an introduction of a new covenant. The law was under the Mosaic covenant. But here we see a new covenant. And this new covenant is a covenant of grace that comes through Jesus Christ and the atonement. And so when we look at Scripture, we see the old and we see the new. In fact, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I remember growing, I think I might have told this story a couple of weeks ago, but I'm going to tell it again. When I was in high school, I was in Sunday school class, and they asked me something about the Old Testament. I said, I don't know, I'm a New Testament guy. And because I spend all my time in the New Testament. I love the New Testament. But there's value in the Old Testament as well. And the Old Testament and the New Testament is really this. When you look at the Greek word for testament, it actually translates to the word covenant. And so Old Testament and New Testament, really all it means is Old Covenant and New Covenant. So the Old Covenant is the Mosaic covenant of law, and the New Testament is the new covenant of grace that comes through Jesus Christ and the atonement. It comes only because of the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And a lot of times people commonly misunderstand this because they see that as Old Covenant and New Covenant, and they misunderstand the concept that the law no longer applies because Jesus has come and taken care of that. The law no longer applies. Well, we live in a fallen world, and anytime you give someone license to sin, guess what? They're going to sin because they don't even have to have a license to sin. They're going to sin. And so Jesus comes to bring us this new covenant, but he's not getting rid of the law. And this is where we find our text today. We're going to be continuing in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 20. Actually, we're going to go farther than that, but the first passage we're going to look at is Matthew 5, 17 through 20. And this is where Jesus directly begins to address the law. Up until this point in the Sermon on the Mount, he's talked about the Beatitudes. He's talked about being salt and light. He's beginning to lay this foundation of how we should live and how we should live. And for the people who are hearing this is countercultural to the things that they've been taught. And so Jesus is reading his audience, and he's saying, I've got to relate this to them in a way that they're going to understand it and still be countercultural, still be different. And so when they're hearing these things that he's about to say, it's going to cause them to question the law. And so Jesus says this right off the bat in Matthew 5, verse 17. He says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. Right off the bat, he's saying, I'm not getting rid of the law. I'm not here to abolish it. I have not come to abolish them, but I have come to fulfill them. Jesus says, I'm not coming to get rid of it. I'm coming to fulfill it. We'll look at that in just a second. But he continues on and says, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not any iota or not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. If you don't know what iota or dot means, you might have heard the term jot and tittle, because that's what Hebrew punctuation was. There was no punctuation. These were little accent marks. And so not till every one of those, not till heaven and earth will pass away, nothing, not even the smallest accent mark in the Hebrew language, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So he's saying you're still under the law. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now that last line, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. That's kind of a dig at the scribes and the Pharisees. Why? Well, because they're hypocritical. And they've twisted the law, and they've adjusted the law, and they've made changes. They've amended the law. Very similar to what we see in our government today, that we can pass a bill and put all sorts of stuff on that bill that has nothing to do with that bill, but then it gets passed. They had made amendments and changes and misinterpretations of the law and had gotten away from the spirit that the law was written in, was for holiness and righteousness. So Jesus says here right off the bat, I have not come to get rid of the law. The law is here for a good purpose. We have to have rules. The law is here for a good purpose, and the law is here to help you find holiness and righteousness. But here's the thing. In the law, the punishment is death. So I'm not here to get rid of the law. I'm here to fulfill the law. I'm going to take on the punishment. I'm going to carry it to completion. He did not come to abolish the law. He came to fulfill the law. So what does fulfill mean? Well, fulfill means to bring to completion everything to which it originally pointed. So the law was pointing everybody, every member of the nation of Israel, it was pointing them to God. Sin separates us from God. So if you follow this law, then you will be living with God. If you follow the law, you'll be living right with God. Well, that was a standard that was extremely impossible to live up to. But God had a plan, and in the plan, Jesus is going to come to fulfill the law, and not just fulfill the law, but he's going to come to fulfill the law completely, so that we no longer have to try and live, even though God is calling us to holiness and righteousness. We will fall short, but we have a substitution. We have a substitution for our punishment. So Jesus fulfills the law. He fulfills the punishment of the law, of failing to live up to the law completely. And he says it right off the bat, I'm here to do this. And they didn't fully understand it. But his goal, Jesus fulfilled the law completely. It's still there. And in fact, when we continue into this Sermon on the Mount, we're going to see that not only did Jesus not take away the law, I like to say he put the law on steroids, because he ramps it up. And he starts to ask more than what the law actually said. So how do we fit into this? If the law was written for the nation of Israel, Jesus came and fulfilled the law completely, where do we, as 2022 American, some of us followers of Christ, some of us not, how do we fit into this? Well, as we've mentioned before with the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is changing things. He's changing the thought process. He's changing the perspective, the way you look at things. The law, at least the way the Pharisees interpreted the law, was focused on the outside. Your outward actions, the thing that you were doing. They did not see that those outward actions actually came from what was happening inside of your heart. They had a list of laws, a list of tasks that they needed to complete and check off and say, I did this right, I did this right, I did this right, I did this right, so now I'm living right with God. Everything was external. Jesus comes and says the law is it's not just for the outside, but I'm going to focus on the inside. I'm going to focus on what's going on the inside. The believers were to exhibit a righteousness that surpassed that of the Pharisees. The Pharisees, to them, righteousness was a tally sheet that of kept commands. I obeyed all 10 of these commandments that were given on Mount Sinai. I've followed the rules of sacrifice to the right way. I've eaten everything right. I have not strayed from the laws that were given to me. So therefore, I have received righteousness. Jesus used them as the foil in his sermon here. What righteousness could they have possibly lacked if they followed this to a T? What could they have lacked? Well, then he goes and he now gives 5 examples. And we're going to look at 2 of them today. Then next week we'll look at the rest of them. He gives examples of how we move past that. And how in our heart we're not holy or righteous. Because it's not our outward actions that disobey God. It's our inward actions. We disobey God because of what's inside of us. And those inner thoughts, those inner actions, those inner things cause us to act on the outside to further that disobedience of God. But we disobey God because of what's on the inside. So Jesus moves into this section, and he's going to contrast what they have been taught. Now, do you ever remember, some of you will know this vividly, some of you won't, the first time someone in a teaching capacity or a mentorship capacity or some sort of authority capacity over you taught you something different than what you've always known? My freshman year of college, I went to a small Presbyterian school in Arkansas. Not because I was Presbyterian, that's just where God led me for a year. And I remember I had always grown up in the Southern Baptist Church, and women could not be pastors. And there's a debate going on in the Southern Baptist Convention right now of what does that mean. My belief in that is that falls to the senior or lead pastor role, that women have great gifts of pastoring and shepherding and ministering and just loving and all of that. But when it comes to the office of pastor of the church, I believe that Scripture holds that. But that was my first experience with a female pastor. The pastor of the church that was based at our school was female. And that challenged everything I had ever been taught. So I had to really dive and study and seek counsel. But I remember that was kind of the first time in my life that something I had grown up believing. And I don't agree with that, but it challenged me. Now, Jesus is going to take some things and challenge them. And he's going to basically say, it's been said, or you've heard it said, or it's been written, but now I say. And Jesus can say, I say this with authority. It's been said this, but now I'm going to say this. And he's going to take, it's awesome getting a phone call at 11:45 on a Sunday morning. He's going to take this concept that was written in the law, that was focused on the outside, and he's going to turn it to the inside. Because the things on the inside, the things that we do, the thoughts, the actions, the feelings that we have, directly impact our outward actions towards other people. And that's what this section of Scripture that Jesus is teaching on here is going to focus on, is how do we react to people? And he's basically saying this: it's not okay to not be okay with people. It's not okay to not be okay with people. Because if your heart is not right with other people, then you aren't right with God. You aren't right with God if you aren't living rightly with other people. Well, that's easy to say, but we don't have any specifics on that. Where are we going with this? What do we do? Well, what Jesus is going to say here is, if you don't do this, if you're not going to live right with other people by taking what the law says and taking it a step further, then you're going to see that your horizontal relationships, your relationships with the people around you, is going to affect your vertical relationship. Your relationship with the people around you that you interact with on a daily basis, if you're not right with them, it's going to affect your relationship day to day with God. And I know for most of us, when we hear that statement right there, the first thing that we think about is tension, or someone has offended me, and I'm hurt, and I need to forgive. Yes, but that's not exactly what Jesus is talking about here. Jesus is now going to talk about the actions you have towards someone. Not that someone's hurt you and you're offended and they need to forgive you, so your relationship isn't right there. What are you doing towards someone? And he starts with this. In verse 21, the law says this. The law says, do not murder. But I say, don't be angry. The law says, do not murder, but I say, don't be angry. Verse 21, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you this, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled with your brother and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. Because truly I say to you in verse 26, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Jesus is now taking the law and show how the law's true intent went far beyond the superficial interpretation of the Pharisees. The law forbid murder. But Jesus says, don't be angry. Because what is the root cause of murder? Anger. Something has made you angry, made a person angry, that they're willing to take someone's life. But he says here in the rest of 5:21 through 26 that if you're harboring anger to someone, the gifts that you want to give to God is not acceptable. Because you're not coming with a pure, clean heart. You've got to get over it. You can't be angry anymore. You have to move past it so that you can get right with God. Anger is like murder in the heart. And that anger can lead to evil words and actual murder. You know, and the little kids saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Words said out of anger can destroy. And they can murder a spirit. And I will tell you that in today's culture, one of the things that's destroying our culture is generational abuse. And that abuse is, when I say generational abuse, it means someone is abusing a child or abusing a spouse because they were abused by a parent or a spouse or someone. And they're harboring anger towards those people, and they've never gotten past that anger, and now that anger is being taken out on someone else. And they're abusing them because of that. And it's destroying them. And unfortunately, so often this anger in our hearts, it festers and it bubbles up and it boils over to where we ultimately might actually murder. It's a hard thing for us to deal with when it comes to anger, because many of us have a right to be angry. But Ephesians tells us, don't let the sun set on your anger. If you get mad, if you get upset, if you get angry, reconcile it. Go to that person. Talk to them. Discuss it. Move on with it. There were times Jesus got angry. I mean, he turned the tables over in the temple. And then he moved on. Don't let your anger fester and harbor until things get worse. talks about the judgment and the council. Think of the context that they're in. They're living in Jewish law. And so the judgment that is being referred to here is taking someone to court. And the council is the Jewish Sanhedrin, which was the highest court of the land. And so Jesus is saying, don't get to that point. You're so angry with someone that you take them to court in front of the highest court of the land, and then there's a judgment placed upon you or them. Because if you go angry, this is where he ends this passage. He says, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. The tables could turn on you. And when that happens, if it gets to that point, if you've harbored this anger long enough, and now you're guilty of the sin, of the crime that you're being accused of, you will not get out of that punishment until the last penny is paid. And he's saying a holy, righteous life is not worth this anger. It's not worth destroying a spirit. It's worth reconciliation. And we've seen this in churches throughout history, that anger has overtaken the church. And that hurts the church. But what hurts the church and kills the church is when that anger takes the place of reconciliation. They don't come to try and work it out as family. They move from outside of the church into the community, and the community sees the church tearing each other apart. If you are angry with someone in your life, go to them. Don't wait for them to take the first step. You do it, and do it quickly before things get worse. Make things right. Because your horizontal relationships directly affect your vertical relationship. If you aren't right with other people, your relationship with God is going to suffer. Now, Jesus goes to one that might make some people feel a little bit uncomfortable. He says, the law says, do not commit adultery. But I say, don't be lustful. Don't lust. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that of your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that of your whole body go into hell. And it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery themselves. Now, we're not going to focus a lot on the divorce thing today, because Jesus doesn't put a ton right here about divorce, only saying basically that the only correct way for divorce is through unfaithfulness. And he covers it way more in detail in Matthew chapter 19. And we can look at that another day. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that today. But what I want to talk about is something that many of us struggle with, both men and women. And for generations, it's always been focused at the man. And I think part of it is because this verse talks about a man lusting. But I know as our culture and our country and our society becomes more and more hypersexualized, that women struggle with this issue just as much. And it's this idea of lusting. And Jesus says, do not lust, because if you do, it's like you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. He's specifically condemning lust as a form of adultery. But here's the thing. Jesus wants us to be pure in heart. And the thing that can separate us more quickly than anything in our relationship with God is a heart that is not pure in this area. Because we can hide this really well. We can hide it really, really well. More so than so many other things. And it keeps this separation from God. So much so that Jesus uses hyperbole. Anybody remember what hyperbole is from English growing up? It's exaggeration, major exaggeration. I always liked the word hyperbole because I equated it with Super Bowl. Super Bowl was the biggest football game ever, and hyperbole are big exaggerations, and that's how I remembered what it was. And he uses hyperbole here because he's like, if you can't get your lust under control, take out your eye. Because that makes it public, right? How many people would be walking around with eye patches or 2 eye patches or whatever, right? We'd be a really pirate-looking society if we were to really do this. And he also says if you can't handle, touch and it lead to lust, cut off your hand. So we really would be a pirate-looking society with patches and hooks. He's using an exaggeration here to say this is killer. This is going to destroy your relationship with God. This will take you out of righteousness quicker than anything. This use of hyperbole is a common biblical means of making a strong point. He does not intend for you to physically maim yourself, but he's emphasizing how serious this sin is and its consequences. He's saying, don't do it. Because a lustful heart is the beginning of a physical adulterous relationship. When it enters your mind and you start thinking about it, it makes it a whole lot easier to act upon it. I just went blank on the name of the book. But there was a book several years ago about men struggling with this, and they said to just take anything out of your vision that would cause you to lust. Guard your eyes. And Every Man's Battle, that's the name of the book. And that's extremely difficult to do. You can't even turn a TV show on. You can't turn the news on. You can't drive down the street without the temptation being there. So how do you do that? How do you guard your eyes? What begins with your heart. Guard your heart. Fill your heart with Jesus, with God, with God's desire for righteousness in your life, with his instructions, with his word. Get into him. Learn him. And allow him to live through you. And that temptation gets less and less and less. It'll always be there because the enemy knows that that's a way to take us out. But God can help us get through it. And Jesus talks about divorce here. We're not going to talk a lot about it, but Jesus talks about divorce because there was, the Pharisees had interpreted this teaching on divorce wrong. And he's saying that one who divorces a spouse without it being a biblically right divorce. And he says sexual immorality here, unfaithfulness here. If you do that, if you do not divorce, if you divorce without biblical reasoning, you contribute to the adultery that may result in the following marriage. If they marry and because we think of divorce in a legal term. We file for divorce, we get a lawyer, we go to the courts and we deal with it. But what we forget is that marriage is a covenant between you, your spouse, and God. And when you divorce and you're both believers, you've broken that covenant with God. And he's not released you from that covenant. And so if your spouse remarries because you divorced them, if you're the one that's divorced them, and then your spouse remarries and that covenant does not have biblical reasoning to be broken, then guess what? They're living in adultery according to what Jesus is saying here. Now, we do have grace in all of this. And that is important to know as well. Because some of you might be sitting there with your heart beating saying, oh my goodness, I've screwed up so bad in the past. Jesus offers grace. Because remember, he came to fulfill the law. He took on our punishment. He was our substitutionary atonement. He talks about anger and lust, and I think he talks about them first because he realizes they can destroy the soul. They should be dealt with quickly. And we are to be called to live to a higher standard. Because remember, the Sermon on the Mount is not for everyone. It's for those who want a true, genuine relationship with God, that are striving to live a life of holiness and righteousness and purity. Jesus is saying in this passage that you've got to be radical in ridding yourselves of the things on earth that keep you from the things of heaven. Anger and lust. Get those under control. Be radical in getting those under control so that you can so that they won't keep you from the things of heaven. And I think one of the main truths for us to hear today as I end is the Sermon on the Mount is teaching us that we are all murderers and we are all adulterers. No one is innocent in this. But through Christ, all of us can be righteous. And that's a promise that I want to live my life on.